This is the World Organic News for the week ending 27th of March 2017. Jon Moore reporting. We begin this week with a post from Farmer 406. No dirt, no problem. Strawbale Gardening. Quote, the concept of growing food from a bale of straw was odd at first until I thought it through. Commercial growers have been using alternative growing mediums for years. So why not scale it down to the backyard do-it-yourselfer? It is of course different from growing in dirt. End quote. The idea is to line up a row of straw bales into garden beds. Turn the bales so as to have the stems facing vertically and the bale twine on the sides. This allows for better water retention and the twine doesn't rot so quickly, usually lasting the entire first season. The bales are then wetted and some sort of fertiliser added to the top. This is done to start the decomposition process. A fish and or kelp-based fertiliser is applied and the bales begin to decompose. Into the spaces between the lines of straw, seedlings or seeds are placed, continue as per any other garden bed. The advantages of this system are numerous. Good organic matter, great drainage, heated beds at the start of spring from the decomposition process, no digging, always a plus for me, and almost non-existent weed issues, especially if the bales are clean of weeds to start with, and a ready-made pile of organic matter for the next season's garden beds. This is also a great way to start gardening on compacted soils, thin soils, soils like to be a bit wet at the start of spring, and excessively sandy soils. All these conditions, except for the excess water, require the incorporation of organic matter to render them suitable for gardening. With straw bale gardens, you start the process above the soil and let the soil biota, earthworms and microbia, do the incorporating for you. I used a variation of this method by using the straw as bedding for dairy goats over winter and piling the bedding, complete with manures and urine, into garden beds. In all cases, the organic matter boost and a food harvest is the outcome. I have also seen these gardens done with spoil bales of lucerne hay. That's alfalfa for those listening in the Americas. To my mind, this is overkill, but it does bump up the nitrogen levels, especially in the second season, so it might be an option depending on your rotation plans. However you do it, it is a viable option as far as I can see. Our next post, doubts about the promised bounty of genetically modified crops as reported in the blog Septosphere, couldn't be more different. To sum up the thrust of the post before we dig a little deeper. Quote, 20 years ago, Europe largely rejected genetic modification at the same time the United States and Canada were embracing it. Comparing the results of the two continents using independent data as well as academic and industry research shows how the technology has fallen short of the promise. End quote. The big sales pitch with GMOs back in the late 1980s and 1990s was the promised reduction in pesticides. This has occurred, but not in isolation. Whilst the pesticide use has fallen, it is still being used, and alongside this is a huge jump in herbicide use. Let me explain the process of GMO farming. GMO seeds are designed to be resistant to pests and to withstand the application of herbicides. That being the case, each cell of the GMO plant contains a pesticide, which is deadly to insects and apparently safe to humans and other non-insect animals to consume. Therefore, there is no need to spray insecticides. Now, the resistance to herbicides means the farmer doesn't have to till between the rows of plants to remove weeds. They just need to spray a herbicide. A herbicide whose patent coincidentally is owned by the GMO seed producers. So the claimed benefits of GMO farming are less pesticides, less tillage and better weed destruction. The reality is a little more complex. The one thing that appears to have been overlooked is a thing the scientific community like to call evolution. How does that work in this situation, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. By spraying the one herbicide the GMO plants are resistant to, glyphosate, you might know it as Roundup, over the populations of weeds year in and year out, the farmer is in reality changing the local environment of the weed species. Creating a new ecological niche is another way to think of it. Once the weeds were growing in competition to the plough, the crop and the application of herbicides. Now the weed species are living in a niche where resistance to herbicide alone will ensure reproductive success. And it is worth remembering that reproductive success within a given niche is the sole purpose of the evolutionary process. So not surprisingly, over time, the GMO farming sector has been carefully selecting for weed species with an ability to survive being sprayed by Roundup and then reproducing. Even less surprising is the seeds these plants scatter on their demise are also, mostly, resistant to Roundup. It would appear that the resistance to Roundup is on a sliding scale, and so further applications of this herbicide were found to be effective at removing many of the semi-resistant individual plants. Can you see where this is heading? Yes. Much more herbicide is used in the US and Canada than in Europe. Ah, but I hear you cry. Much less pesticide is also used in North America. Yes, but so too is that figure falling in Europe, mainly through the use of ecological methods such as crop rotations, companion planting, interplanting, and the retention of hedging, which acts as a base for insect-eating birds and predatory insect species. Toss in the World Health Organization's findings in 2016 that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen, and the longer-term prospects for GMO farming look poor. Remember, glyphosate is marketed as Roundup, the most ubiquitously used herbicide in not just agricultural settings, but also in suburban gardens and local authority weed reduction plans. What's to be done? If only 10% of us turn those lawns into Strawbale gardens, the use of glyphosate would plummet. The two posts I've highlighted this week represent alternative ends of the agricultural spectrum. We have, in the West, since the Second World War, handed over our food production from the garden level to the industrial. If you think of the health changes in that time, one thing stands out. Body mass in both the West and the industrialising nations of the world. The experiment has been run on the GMO method, and the side effects are, I believe, not worth the expense. So line up your straw bales, shorten your supply lines, and taste real food again. And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. If you've liked what you've heard, please tell everyone you know any way you can. I'd also really appreciate a review on iTunes or the podcatcher that you use. This helps others to find us. Thanks in advance. Any suggestions, feedback or criticisms of the podcast or blog are most welcome. Email me at podcast@worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back in a week.